There are many different ways of reading the book of Revelation. In this companion, Judith Kovach and Christopher Rowland differentiate between two broad categories of readings, which they call decoding and actualization. I'm going to explain this to you now because the difference between decoding and actualization is quite complicated. It has to do with the assumptions that you make about the text as a reader and that you make about the divine wisdom that is revealed to you in this text. So if you are a religious reader and you believe that the text should be decoded, then you assume that the text contains specific information about John's future that was given to him in the form of a riddle, and that we as readers need to find the key to make sense of this riddle. So, for example, Martin Luther, one of the prominent figures of the German Protestant Reformation, read the book of Revelation and assumed that the part which refers to the Antichrist was a warning in which John was told about the dangers of abuse of power by the papacy in Luther's own days, in the 16th century. So if you make assumptions about the meaning of the text, about the meaning that is encoded into the text and can be decoded, then you have to bring the right key to this text. At the other end of the spectrum is what Kovach and Rowland call actualization, which is the claim that the text has a divine meaning which becomes a form of truth that is revealed to you in your circumstances. So there is no single key, there is no meaning which is written into the text once and for all, but for example, the book teaches you something about violence, teaches you something about justice, teaches you something about the importance of community, and so on and so forth. So you would say, broadly speaking, that what Rowland and Kovach call actualization is a form of allegorical reading. Right? An allegory has a broad meaning, but the meaning depends on our own circumstances when we read it. If we're not Christian readers, if we're not religious believers, we can still read the book of Revelation. We can still be interested in these processes of actualization. So we can still find that the text teaches us something. It teaches us something which we might consider problematic about a particular idea of end time, for example, about a particular way in which sort of things reach a conclusion. But let's go back to decoding, because when we look at the history of readings of the book of Revelation, we find that there are enormous differences between different interpretations of the text, which were decodings. So over the course of centuries and centuries of in the history of Christianity, different theologians, different thinkers, different philosophers, different writers have read this text and have believed that they have the right key to unlock its meaning. I told you before that the text was written in a moment of great distress, and that, like all apocalyptic texts, it creates this strong sense of community and this sense of urgency. Now, decoding is very interesting in relation to this. If you believe that the text speaks to you and speaks to you about your immediate future, then the sense of urgency will be enormous. It will be very, very greatly felt. Right? If you open this book and you think you like some evangelical Christians might do, that this narrates events which are taking place right now all around you. Say you open the book and you believe that the current president of the United States is Antichrist, or you believe that the European Union is Antichrist. You want to sort of free yourself from these influences. Then you have a sense that this key was handed over to you across generations, and it's meaningful right now, and it galvanizes this great sense of urgency. Many books of apocalyptic writing originated in the first century after the death of Christ. Many books that are not part of the canonical Bible, many books that are now known as Apocrypha, and they all share this sense of urgency. So we know that the period surrounding the birth of Christ was a period in the near Middle East, was a period of great turmoil. People were incredibly nervous about what the future would bring. Something very interesting happens. After some centuries, as you know, the Christian church becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Right? Emperor Constantine wins this important battle using the crucifix and his shield, and he therefore then subsequently decides to introduce Christianity as a state religion. From this moment onwards, something very important shifts in the way that Christian theologians conceive of secular power. That early sense of urgency, that idea that the book of Revelation tells us to rebel, that early sense begins to appear problematic to commentators who suddenly see that, in fact, they have an interest in maintaining some kind of sort of stability, some social order. Because the church is itself now part of this large, vast social order. One of the early thinkers who expresses this is Origen, the Christian theologian, and subsequently one of the most important theologians to develop this is Augustine of Hippo, Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine makes a very specific point, which he takes from Origen and which he develops in his writings. And it's a very simple point, and it has to do with how Saint Augustine decodes the text. He says, careful, this text isn't all about our future. When John wrote it, it was all about John's future, but in fact, many of these battles have taken place, and many of these battles have been won by Christianity. So, St. Augustine goes back to the text, and you'll remember that quite late in the book of Revelation, there is a mention of a 1,000-year period, right? After this huge battle where Satan himself appears and Christ appears on the field of Armageddon, and they fight, and Satan is defeated, and Satan is imprisoned for 1,000 years. And for 1,000 years, there is a kingdom of the just. Augustine has a very intelligent idea. He says, we are actually living in this period now. We are living this 1,000-year period of peace and stability. And it's exactly the 1,000 years in which the church holds official power. The church has become the official state religion of the Roman Empire. So you must not think that the book invites you to rebel against the existing secular order, because in fact many of these events that are described in the book happened in John's future, but happened in Augustine's past. They happened during the early years when Christianity was a religion that was persecuted by the empire. And Augustine says at the very end, after this 1,000-year period, when the millennium reaches its conclusion, there will be one last moment of battle, which is the last judgment. Christ will reappear, Satan will reappear, and Satan will be defeated definitively, and Christ will triumph in the heavenly Jerusalem. And this will be the end of history. This, Augustine says, is our future. From Augustine's perspective, it's the end of history. So it's the moment which by definition lies in our collective future. So the interesting thing about this reading, which is called the post-millennial reading, is twofold. On the one hand, it raised questions, as you know, in the cultural history of the West, in the cultural history of Europe, because people were very, very anxious about when this 1,000-year period would end. And you may know that around the year 1000, there were massive upheavals, and people were extremely worried that the world would come to an end, because they thought that this 1,000-year period would end. And then other theologians at the time said, no, actually, you shouldn't calculate it from the moment of the death of Christ, but you should calculate it from the moment of the book of Revelation, etc. So people try to sort of post-date this moment. But there is a sort of big question: if do you read this 1,000-year period literally, or do you read it again as a kind of sort of as an encoded message? 1,000 years doesn't mean 1,000 years. Right? So it raises these kinds of difficulties. But the official position of the Catholic Church, the post-millennial reading, also provides an opportunity for other religious movements to disagree. So other religious movements challenge this official reading and say, this is not true. The events that are being described, the message that is encoded in the book of Revelation, these are events which are relevant to us today. So we have these movements which are called millennial movements, because they make the power of the book of Revelation relevant to their own political present. There's a very important book by Norman Cohn called The Pursuit of the Millennium, in which he analyzes several of these big movements in the 12th century preceding and 13th century preceding the Protestant Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, and he talks about these charismatic leaders. So typically these movements, these millenarian movements, are short-lived, and they build around a charismatic leader, and they free a lot of energy. They create these very powerful bonds, because people feel that the moment has come for them to free themselves of all earthly ties and to stand up to the worldly powers, and to claim their own freedom to live according to the true, according to their own understanding of the true religion. So interestingly, as I said before, the Catholic Church is a post-millennial, is committed to a post-millennial vision of the book of Revelation, or you could say to post-millennial eschatology. Many different Protestant churches, including some evangelical Christian movements, particularly but not exclusively in North America, insist that the meaning of these events is relevant now. So we call these pre-millenarian readings of the book of Revelation. You can see how the energy of these pre-millenarian readings can be extremely problematic, and of course when we talk about millenarian movements, we talk about cults and sects, and we talk about we also very often aware of the way this opens the possibility of an abuse of power, right, by these charismatic leader figures. But we also understand that from a point of view of cultural history, these pre-millenarian readings provide a particularly powerful sense of our relation as readers with the texts. So when we will move into some of the literary readings of the book of Revelation, and we will see how these tropes of the book of Revelation are used by writers, including secular writers, we will find that they often build on the tradition of pre-millenarian readings. So they build on this. They seek to, what they take away from the book of Revelation in all kinds of different contexts. It could be comic strips, could be computer games, could be films. Apocalypse is such a broad category now, but what they all take away from this tradition of reading is this sense of urgency, the sense that the catastrophe and the need for a different kind of community is felt now in our present.